Welcome again. My name is Will from Virtual Technologies. I'm here with John Hope, who's a senior technology evangelist from Sophos.
Hi, Will.
Hi, and today we're going to talk about the continuing threat of cybersecurity in education and what Sophos are seeing from their point of view. And who better than John, because John knows so much about what's happening in cybersecurity at the moment. So let's start off with the first question, which is, why do you feel, John, that education is a target at the moment?
Okay, well, it's important, Will, to understand how cyber criminals are motivated. And with the exception of politically motivated attacks, really cyber criminals pick their victims based on a simple return on investment model in the same way that a legitimate business would. So when they look at education, what they see is a combination of factors. If you think about an education establishment and the kind of data they hold, there's a lot of very interesting and very valuable data. So you will hold on a typical school things like parental bank details and credit card data. Yeah. You'll have things like passport scans and driving license scans, as well as the sensitive stuff like special education needs records and all that kind of thing. Yeah. So there's a lot of valuable data there. The cyber criminals are also very acutely aware that education is pretty much universally speaking a sector which is under-resourced, under-financed, and therefore doesn't necessarily have the best access to security technologies, probably looking at an IT staff that's inundated with responsibilities. So they kind of see this combination of interesting data and in relative terms, a poorly defended establishment, and therefore education has really been a key target.
Bit of a soft target.
Basically, it's a soft target. As I said, it's all worked out on ROI. If you look at the State of Ransomware report going back to 2023, education was the sector that was most likely to be hit by ransomware, according to our own research data. And whilst that has evened out a little bit in 2024, education is still one of the sectors which is more popularly targeted by the cyber criminals. In fact, there are certain elements of cybercrime gangs that actually very specifically target education.
Yeah. They're being targeted, but who are these hackers? What are they? Because they're not what we think they are. They're not kids in hoodies, are they, anymore?
Absolutely not. No. I mean, if you look at the media, then cyber criminals are almost universally portrayed as being hoodie-toting teenagers hanging out in mom and pop's basement.
Lights turned out.
Yeah, it's generally dimly lit. I don't know why, but it seems to be the way. But the reality is not like that. And we learned a huge amount about the structure of cybercrime gangs thanks to the breakup of Conti. So Conti, going back to 2021, were really prolific ransomware creators and distributors, and a very rapid decline based on Russia's activities in the Ukraine. So Conti very publicly announced that they were in support of Russia's activities and would support them with cyber means. But because of the structure of cybercrime gangs, actually many of the affiliates operating inside Conti were actually Ukrainians. So you can appreciate they weren't necessarily particularly on board with that message. And what happened was Conti essentially disintegrated from the inside, and a huge amount of data spilled out about things like the structure of the gang and internal communiques. And what we learned by piecing all of these things together is that most people in cybercrime gangs probably have a line manager. They have monthly targets, monthly salary, career progression. The gangs have marketing departments. It is remarkably like a legitimate business. Yeah. And that's really important to understand, because what it means is that these cybercrime gangs have enormous financial resources and also enormous human resources as well. So they can instead of having to rely on code-based attacks and actually sending out malicious files and creating malicious websites, they're actually able to deploy humans on individual attack exercises. Yeah. And it makes it typically quite difficult for cybersecurity vendors to protect against it, because code is predictable, inherently behaves the same way every time, whereas humans, they learn, they adapt to their processes, their techniques, and it's really changed the scope of cybersecurity.
And they are adapting, aren't they? So they're adapting to human practice and nature of their targets, so they don't attack during the day, typically, from your experience. They attack at weekends and nights and...
No, absolutely. So if you define working hours as 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. Monday through Friday, 91% of the attacks were landing outside of that time frame. So that tells you an awful lot. And education is a sector which is even more predictable because, of course, we publish term times, and by extension we know when education establishments maybe don't have anybody around, and then the cyber criminals know when it's an opportune moment to strike off the back end of that.
Yeah, so that typical kind of Friday afternoon when you're thinking about the weekend and maybe not focused on finishing your task properly.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, it's a common time to land is a Friday, because they get all weekend, or maybe even longer if it's the end of a term, inside a network before anybody realises this is actually a problem. Yeah, absolutely.
And then there's I've heard you talk previously about this thing called dwell time, which is the time from an initial attack starting to when you become aware of it.
Absolutely, yes. So typically a victim of ransomware is probably going to realise at the point where they're actually getting ransom notes appearing on the screen, but that's not where the attack started at all. And dwell time is exactly what you've said, is that measurement of time from the initial reconnaissance through to actually the cybercriminals carrying out their action on an objective. We used to measure that in weeks and months, but the cybercrime gangs have got so skilled at what they do that now a typical dwell time is less than 5 days. And what that means is an organisation has, from the initial warning signs through to actually receiving ransom demands, typically 5 days or less.
So what are they doing in that period? Because not just relaxing with their feet apart, things are happening, aren't they, in that time? Occasionally
they might be sitting and relaxing and waiting for the opportune moment to strike, but they're probably deepening their presence inside the estate. Often it will start with a compromised set of user credentials. The cyber criminals will get in, and then they'll use those credentials to maybe move laterally and look around the rest of the estate. They might escalate their privileges so they can get further access into sensitive systems. Increasingly, we see exfiltration of data as part of the process, so that maybe they can either sell that data or they can further extort their victims by threatening to publicize that data. So there's a whole bunch of things that go on, and then at the opportune moment to strike, they will start the encryption process. And that, like I said, is typically the first time a victim organisation realises they've got a problem.
And one thing that you've said previously that quite often happens in that time is they'll start trashing your backups first, or trying to affect your backups.
Absolutely, yeah. So we take data from a number of backup vendors because it is very much an early warning indicator. In 95% of cases, the cyber criminals are actively going after a backup in some way, and it's precisely for the reasons you've indicated. An organisation is unlikely to pay a ransom demand if they've got a good backup. Why would you pay them? So actually destroying the backups or compromising the backups in some way, making them useless, is very much an early stage of an attack. But it's not always immediately obvious. So they will do things like changing passwords, changing scopes of backups, kind of insidious ways that don't trigger alerts, because the whole purpose of that period of dwell time is really to be under the radar, not be detected until the point where they're actually willing to show their hand and encrypt data. So yeah, lots of insidious ways.
Right. Well, that's really useful, John. Thanks very much for your time today, and hope to see you again soon.
My pleasure. No problem at all.
Thank you.